On the first night of the Carlisle ball, in the third week of a cold London spring, a young woman named Margaret stood at the edge of a room that had already decided what she was. The chandeliers above her held 200 candles, and every one of them seemed arranged to fall on someone other than her. She wore a gown of plain dove-gray muslin, neat at the seams, mended once at the left wrist where no one would think to look. Around her the season glittered in saturated silk and sapphires and rose-pink and gold thread, and against all of it, her gray was the color of a thing the eye passes over, on its way to something brighter. She had learned to stand very still in such rooms. Stillness was a kind of shelter. A woman who did not move did not have to watch the faces, deciding she was not worth the trouble of a second glance. Near the great doors, where the crowd thickened and the orchestra could barely be heard above the talk, the Duke of Wexford had just been announced. He came in without hurry, a tall man in a dark blue coat cut close to the shoulder, his cravat white and exact, his face composed into the kind of stillness that great men wear like armor. The room turned toward him the way a field of grass turns toward weather. Mothers adjusted their daughters. The orchestra found its place again. And at his elbow, arranged as carefully as a jewel in a setting, stood Lady Cordelia Vane, the diamond of the season. In ice-blue satin that caught the candlelight and held it. To everyone watching, the matter was settled. The Duke had chosen the elegant lady, and the elegant lady had chosen to be chosen, and the rest of the season was merely the arithmetic of when it would be announced. What none of them knew, what Margaret herself had told no one, was that twice a week she sat in a quiet room in a house near the palace, and read aloud to a man whose eyesight had begun to fail him, a man whose name she was forbidden to speak in company, a man whose good opinion could unmake a duke. Stay with me through the cold open of this one, because the woman the room refused to see was the only person in it the crown trusted, and the night it became known changed everything. The Duke had not yet looked at her. He would, though not tonight. And not the way the room expected. Margaret Ashby was 24 years old, and she had been 24 for what felt to her like a very long time. Her father had been a country clergyman with more books than income, a gentle scholar who had taught his only daughter Latin and Greek, and the trick of reading a room before she could read a primer. He had died when she was 19, and the small living that fed them died with him. And Margaret had come to London the way a leaf comes to a gutter, carried by forces she did not choose. An aunt had taken her in on the understanding that she would make herself useful and quiet and grateful. And Margaret had made herself all three. She had also, through a chain of small kindnesses she could not have predicted, come to the attention of the household near the palace, where an old gentleman of considerable importance and considerable infirmity wanted someone to read to him who would not gossip about what she read. She had not gone looking for it. That was the thing she returned to, on the nights when the season's coldness pressed hardest. She had simply done the small, dull, good thing in front of her, week after week, expecting nothing, and the world had quietly noticed her in a way it would not say aloud. The old gentleman called her Miss Ashby, and complained about the dust and the draughts, and the foolishness of his physicians. And twice he had asked her opinion of a letter before he sent it, and once he had taken her advice. She told no one. To tell would have been to lose it, and to lose it would have been to lose the one place in London where she was a person, rather than a problem to be solved. The aunt who housed her, Mrs. Bland, Penhallow, regarded Margaret as a debt that could not quite be called in. At the Carlisle ball she stood beside her niece for exactly as long as politeness required, then drifted toward the card tables, leaving Margaret to the wall. Before she went, she leaned in, close enough that Margaret could smell the violet water and the wine, and said in the low voice people use when they mean to be overheard, "Do try not to look so much like a governess child. No one weds the furniture." A woman nearby laughed behind her fan. The phrase settled on Margaret, like cold water down the back of the neck. And she felt her own pulse jump in her throat, and she kept her face perfectly still. No one weds the furniture. It was not even cruel. quite. It was simply how the room had decided to see her, and her aunt had only said it first. Across the floor, the Duke of Wexford had been cornered by Lady Cordelia's mother, a handsome woman with a strategist's eyes, and he answered her with the brief, level courtesy of a man counting the minutes. He did not enjoy these rooms. He had reasons. The room did not know. 3 years before, he had buried a younger brother who had drowned in the Solent, on a wager Wexford had been too proud and too busy to forbid, and somewhere in the years since, the part of him that had laughed easily had gone quiet and stayed quiet. He carried a small thing always in the inner pocket of his coat, against his ribs, and his hand went to it sometimes without his knowing, the way a tongue goes to a missing tooth. The season called him cold. The season was not wrong, exactly. It was only that it had never asked why. He was listening to Cordelia's mother describe her daughter's accomplishments, the harp and the watercolors in the 3 languages, when his eye caught on something at the edge of the room. A woman in gray, standing so still she might have been a study in oils, her chin level, her hands folded, taking the room's indifference without flinching. He did not know her. He noted with the small irritation of a man whose attention has been hooked against his will, that she was the only person in the ballroom not performing. Everyone else was angled toward advantage. She was simply standing, the way a person stands at the back of a church. He looked away. The harp, the watercolors, the 3 languages. He looked back. She had not moved. It was nothing. He told himself it was nothing. And he was a man who was usually obeyed, even by himself. End. Later, when the dancing had thinned the crowd, he found that he knew exactly where in the room she stood without having to look, and that knowledge unsettled him more than he would have admitted to any living soul. The first time the Duke of Wexford spoke to Margaret, it was an accident of weather and bad planning. A week after the Carlisle ball, at a smaller evening party, in a house with a famous library, a sudden spring storm had broken the windows of the night open with rain, and the guests had crowded into the lit rooms while footmen ran for the carriages. Margaret, who disliked crowds the way a bruise dislikes a thumb, had slipped into the library to wait, and found it already occupied. The Duke stood at the far end with his back to her, looking at a shelf as though it had insulted him, a glass of untouched wine on the table at his side. She turned to go. "Stay," he said, without turning around. "The hall is impossible. I have been told there is a first folio of Donne somewhere on these shelves, and I cannot find it, and I refuse to ask the footman, and look a fool." He turned then and saw who it was, and something crossed his face that she could not read, that she assumed was annoyance at being interrupted. "You are the woman in gray," he said from the Carlisle ball. "I am a woman in gray at most balls, Your Grace," Margaret said. "We are difficult to tell apart." She had not meant to say it. It had come out before her caution could stop it, dry and a little sharp, and she braced for the cooling that usually followed when she forgot to be small. He did not cool. For one moment the stern line of his mouth altered, not quite into a smile, but into the memory of where a smile would go. "The folio," he said instead, and gestured at the shelves. And because she had spent her childhood among her father's books and could not help herself, Margaret crossed to the section he had been mauling, ran her finger along the spines, and drew out a slim volume bound in worn calf, 2 shelves below where he had been looking. She handed it to him without comment. His fingers brushed hers as he took it, gloved, and she felt the contact travel up her arm with a warmth entirely out of proportion to a gloved hand and a book, and she stepped back at once and folded her hands and looked at the rain on the window so that he would not see her face do the thing it was doing. "You read," he said. It was not a question. "I had a father who collected books he could not afford," she said. "One learns the shelves." "Sit down," he said. "You are standing as though you expect to be sent away." It was a command, flat and certain, and she heard the rudeness of it, and did not yet hear the thing underneath it, which was that he had noticed she was braced to be dismissed, and did not wish her to be. She sat. They spoke for perhaps a quarter of an hour of Donne and of weather and of nothing, and when the footman came to say the Wexford carriage was ready, The Duke rose and looked at her for a moment, as though he meant to say something, and then did not, and left. Margaret sat in the empty library and pressed her gloved hand flat against the cool table and told herself very firmly that men like the Duke of Wexford did not notice women like her, and that the warmth in her wrist was the warmth of a stuffy room, and that she would do well to remember both. The season, meanwhile, had made up its mind, and the season did not like to be contradicted. Lady Cordelia was seen at the Duke's side at the opera, at 2 dinners, at the Marchmain garden party, where the roses were forced early under glass. She was poised and lovely and entirely correct, and she had been told since girlhood that she was the answer to a question men like Wexford were born asking. She did not dislike Margaret. She did not think of Margaret at all, which is a colder thing. When their paths crossed at a musical evening in May, Cordelia looked at the gray gown and the plain face with the mild, untroubled pity of a woman certain of her ground, and said to her friend, not quite quietly, "It is a charity, I think, that the Penhallow woman drags her niece about. One must do something with the unmarriageable ones, though. I confess I cannot think what." The friend laughed. Margaret, 3 feet away, examined a music stand with great attention. The unmarriageable ones. That was the second time the room had named her aloud, in a different voice, in a different room, and she found that the naming had not lost its edge with repetition. It had only grown a callus around it. She breathed. She kept her face still. She had had a great deal of practice. There was in the Wexford household a child who changed the shape of everything, though no one saw it happening at the time. The Duke had a ward, a boy of 7 named Tom, the son of the drowned brother, a grave, silent child who had not spoken more than a sentence at a time since the funeral. Wexford loved him with the helpless, inarticulate love of a man who does not know how to reach a grief smaller and deeper than his own. And the boy moved through the great house like a ghost who had not been told he was permitted to haunt it. It happened that the household near the palace, where Margaret read twice a week, lay across a small green square from a house the Wexford family used in town. And it happened that on a fine afternoon, Margaret, leaving her reading, found a small boy sitting alone on the steps of the square's locked garden, looking at the gate as though it were the door of a country he had been exiled from. She did not know who he was. She knew only that he was a child, alone and unhappy, and that the iron gate was locked, and that there was a trick to such gates she had learned as a girl. She sat down on the step beside him at a careful distance, and did not ask him what was wrong, which was the thing every adult asked, and which he plainly could not bear. Instead, she told him, in an ordinary voice, about a dog her father had once owned, that could open any latch in the parish, and had been the despair of 3 farmers. The boy did not answer. She told him the latch on this very gate could be sprung if one knew where to press, and that she would show him, on the condition that he never tell, because a secret was only useful if it was kept. And she rose, and pressed the worn place on the old lock the way her father had shown her, and the gate swung open, and the boy looked up at her for the first time with something in his face that was not grief. She did not know that the Duke had come out onto the steps of the house across the square to look for his ward, and had stopped, and had stood very still in the doorway, watching a woman in gray open a locked gate for a silent child, and ask nothing of him in return. She did not know that Wexford stood there, until the boy laughed an actual laugh, the first in 3 years, at something she said about the farmers, and that the sound of it went into the Duke like a blade going into a man who has forgotten he could still feel a wound. She gathered the boy in, walked him twice around the little garden, returned him to the open gate, and went on her way without ever learning whose child he was. Behind her in the doorway, a hard grieving man stood with his hand pressed flat against the inner pocket of his coat, against the small thing he carried there, and understood that he had just seen the thing he had stopped believing existed. If this story is finding you tonight, you already know how it must end, and you are right, and I promise you will have it, though the road there runs through a cold place first. After the garden, the Duke of Wexford began to behave in ways the season could not parse, and Margaret could not believe. He appeared at the dull evening parties he had always avoided. He was seen twice, crossing a crowded room to speak to a woman in grey. Briefly, levelly, about nothing of consequence, and then leaving as abruptly as he came. When Margaret took a chill walking home in the rain, a basket of hothouse fruit arrived at Mrs. Penhallow's door with no card, and Mrs. Penhallow ate most of it herself and concluded it had been misdirected. At a card party Margaret had not wished to attend, the Duke materialized at her shoulder during a moment when an older gentleman had begun to make her uncomfortable with his attentions, and said only, "Miss Ashby, come and tell me whether this hand is as bad as I believe it to be," and steered her away from the man and toward a table where he proceeded to ignore his own cards entirely, and ask her with an intensity that frightened her what she had read that week. She read each of these, as coincidence, as charity, as a great man's idle whim. Her wound would permit no other reading. He could not mean it. Men like Wexford did not mean it. And so she watched her own pulse betray her every time he came near, the warmth climbing her throat, her awareness of exactly where he stood in any room sharpening to a point, and she told herself it was foolishness, and she was ashamed of it, and she could not stop. What she did not see, because her wound would not let her see it, was that the Duke had begun to make inquiries, not loud ones. He was not a loud man, and a man of his rank has only to express a mild curiosity and doors open. And Wexford had expressed a mild curiosity about who the woman in grey was, and where she went on her quiet afternoons, and why a clergyman's penniless daughter carried herself like someone with nothing left to lose and everything still to protect. The answers he received were partial and strange, and they only sharpened the curiosity into something he was not yet willing to name. It was the Dowager who moved first, and the Dowager moved hard. The Dowager Duchess of Wexford, the Duke's grandmother, was a small upright woman of 70, with a face like a closed book, and a will like a winter road. She had buried a husband and a son and a grandson, and she had organized her entire surviving self around the proposition that the Wexford name would not be diminished on her watch by so much as a degree. She had selected Lady Cordelia the way a general selects ground. And when the whispers reached her that her grandson had been seen, more than once paying a particular and inexplicable attention to a nobody in grey muslin, a clergyman's daughter housed on sufferance by a card-playing aunt, the Dowager did not panic. She planned. She invited Margaret to tea. The invitation itself was a marvel of menace, dressed as kindness, and Mrs. Penhallow, scenting advantage, near forced her niece into her best grey and into a carriage. Margaret sat in the Dowager's frost-blue drawing-room with a cup she did not drink, and listened to a small old woman dismantle her future in the gentlest possible terms. The Dowager admired Margaret's composure. The Dowager understood that Margaret was a sensible young woman who knew the world. The Dowager was certain that a sensible young woman would not wish to be the cause of a great family's embarrassment, would not wish to be talked of, would not wish to mistake a great man's passing kindness to a charity case for something it could never be. "My grandson," said the Dowager, setting down her cup with a click like a key turning, "is to marry Lady Cordelia. It is arranged in all but the announcing. You are a clever girl. I am sure you see how it would distress everyone, yourself most of all, if you were to imagine otherwise. You have nothing, Miss Ashby. Less than nothing. A girl with nothing cannot afford to be talked about." It was the third time. A private aside, a public cut, and now a great lady's quiet verdict, delivered over good china. You have nothing. Margaret set down her own cup very carefully so that it would not rattle, and said that she understood the Dowager perfectly, that she had never imagined otherwise, and the dreadful thing was that in that room, in that moment, she believed it. She went home, and she did not weep, because she had taught herself years ago that weeping changed nothing and cost a great deal. And the next afternoon she went to her reading, as she always did, because the old gentleman near the palace was the one fixed point in her life that no Dowager could move. Yet the old gentleman was sharper than his eyes, and he heard something in her reading voice that day, a flatness, a held thing, and he stopped her in the middle of a paragraph and asked her plainly what was the matter. And Margaret, who told no one anything, found to her own horror that she told him a little of it, not the names, never the names, only that she had been reminded of her place by someone who had every right to remind her, and that it had been a useful reminder. The old gentleman was quiet for a while. Then he said something she did not understand at the time. He said, "Place. They are always so very certain about place, the people who have never once had to earn theirs." And he asked her to go on reading, and she did. And she thought no more of it because she did not know who he was, not truly, and could not imagine that her small unhappiness had just become a thing the Crown found interesting. The dowager, having dealt with the girl, dealt next with the grandson, and here she made the single error that confident people make, which is to assume that a thing arranged is a thing accomplished. She announced the engagement. Not formally, not yet, but she let it be known at exactly the right dinners and exactly the right ears, that the Duke of Wexford and Lady Cordelia would be married before the summer was out. And she did it without consulting the Duke at all, on the theory that a public expectation is the easiest cage in the world, and that her grandson, who hated scenes, would rather marry than make one. The news ran through the season like fire through dry grass. Cordelia received congratulations with serene satisfaction. Mrs. Penhallow remarked to Margaret that it was a great match, and that some people knew how to manage these things, and others did not, and looked at her niece as she said it. And Margaret, who had been told 3 times now exactly what she was, folded the news into the cold place where she kept such things, and resolved to stop going to the parties where she might see him, and to be glad, in a flayed and bitter way, that nothing had been said that could be held against her. The dark moment, when it came in the same kind of room where it had all begun. The Hartfield Midsummer Ball was the great crush of the season's end, and Margaret had not meant to go, and her aunt had insisted, because the announcement was expected to be made there, and Mrs. Penhallow would not miss it for the world. So Margaret stood again at the edge of a glittering room in her dove-gray muslin, mended at the wrist, and watched the season assemble to witness the closing of a door she had told herself was never open. The Dowager Duchess of Wexford sat enthroned near the head of the room with Cordelia arranged at her right hand in white and silver, and the Duke stood among them, his face carved and unreadable, his hand drifting now and then to the inner pocket of his coat, and then the Dowager, judging her moment, rose, and the room began to hush in anticipation, and Cordelia's mother smiled, and it was understood that the thing was about to be done. It was at that moment that Lady Cordelia, secure in her victory and unable to resist gilding it, turned to a knot of admirers near enough to Margaret to be heard, and said, lightly, brilliantly, the cruelest version of the only line the room ever gave her. "Poor Miss Ashby! Do look how she watches! As if a girl with no name and no fortune and no face could ever have been anything in a room like this. Some women are born to stand against the wall, and it is a kindness, really, that no one ever lets them forget it." The laughter spread. Margaret felt the heat climb her throat, and her face felt 200 candles and 200 faces, felt the old familiar nothing closing over her head like water. And she understood that the announcement was coming, and that she must not be seen to flinch, and she gathered herself to endure it as she had endured everything, by standing very still. What none of them knew was that the doors at the far end of the ballroom had opened, and that a stir was running backward through the crowd from the entrance, a different kind of stir, the kind that travels when something has arrived that no one planned for. A royal equerry, in the king's livery, was moving through the parting crowd with a sealed letter in his gloved hand, and he was asking, politely and unstoppably, for Miss Ashby of Mrs. Penhallow's household. The room did not understand at first. The name was wrong. The name belonged to the woman against the wall, the charity case, the furniture, and here was the Crown's own man, saying it aloud as though it mattered, asking for her by name, bowing to her, bowing, as he placed into her hands a letter sealed with a device the older heads in the room recognized and went pale at. The orchestra had stopped without anyone telling it to. The dowager was on her feet, the announcement forgotten, her closed-book face open at last to something like alarm. And the equerry said in a voice pitched to Carey that His Majesty sent his compliments to Miss Ashby, whose kindness to a certain old friend of the crown had not gone unremarked, and that the king hoped she would honor the palace with her company at the levee, and that any house in London would be glad, His Majesty was quite sure, to count her among its friends. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the building. 200 people recalculated at once, and the sound of it was no sound at all, only the small rustle of a whole room turning to look at a woman it had spent a season deciding not to see. Margaret stood with the letter in her hands and did not understand it. Not fully only that the old gentleman she read to had a name after all, and that the name was larger than she had ever let herself imagine, and that the small, dull, good thing she had done for years, expecting nothing, had been seen by the one pair of eyes in England that could not be overruled, and the Duke of Wexford, who had stood frozen with the rest, who had watched the woman in grey become, in the space of 30 seconds, the most important person in the room, did not move toward her to claim a fashionable connection, the way every other person present was already calculating how to do. He looked at her face. He saw that she was not triumphant. He saw that she was frightened and bewildered, and entirely alone in the center of a room that had just changed its mind about her for all the wrong reasons. And he saw, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, that the room's new opinion was as worthless as its old one, because both were about the letter and neither was about her, and that he was the only person in the building who had known what she was before the crown said so. He crossed the room, not in haste. 3 long strides through a crowd that fell back before him without being asked, past his grandmother, past Cordelia in her white and silver, past the equerry, until he stood before Margaret Ashby in her mended grey, and the whole season held its breath to see what the Duke of Wexford would do. He did not take the letter. He did not glance at the seal. He took her hand, the gloved hand that had brushed his over a book of Donne, and he bowed over it low, the way a man bows to a woman whose worth he has staked his name upon. And he said, into a silence so complete that the farthest corner heard it, 11 words. I knew her worth before the king thought to mention it. The line landed in the stillness and did not move. No one breathed. The dowager's hand rose halfway to her throat and stopped. And Wexford, still holding Margaret's hand, turned his head, only his head, and looked once at his grandmother, and once at Lady Cordelia in her white and silver, and the look was not cruel. It was only final. To Cordelia he said, level and quiet, you will forgive me. I find I am already promised. And the room understood, all at once and entirely, that the engagement the dowager had announced had been announced by the dowager alone, and that the man himself had chosen otherwise, in public in the same room where his choice had been arranged for him without his consent, and that the choosing could not now be unmade. The dowager did not crumple. She was not a woman who crumpled. Something went out of her upright spine, some certainty that had held her straight for 70 years. And she sat slowly back down in her chair, and she looked at her grandson, and then she looked, for the first time all season, truly looked at the woman beside him. What she saw there, she did not say. Her closed book face had a page open in it now that had not been opened before, and when she rose again a few minutes later it was to leave, and as she passed Margaret, she paused and inclined her head the smallest possible degree, a fraction of an inch, the gesture of a defeated general acknowledging the field. It was not warmth. It was, from her, something rarer. It was correction. Lady Cordelia Vane recovered her composure with the speed of a woman who had spent her life being watched, and she smiled, and she said something gracious, and she was gone within the half-hour to a corner of her own choosing, where she would be congratulated by no one and would begin that very night the long work of becoming a person who had not expected to be the diamond of the season. She was not destroyed. The story did not require her destruction. She was only displaced, moved off the ground she had stood on so confidently, and left to discover what else she might be made of. Some in the room thought her hard done by Most did not think of her at all, which was the coldest thing, and the same coldness she had once turned on a girl in gray. Later. Much later, when the carriages had carried the season home to whisper and recalculate, the Duke of Wexford walked Margaret out into the Hartfield garden where the air was cool and the noise of the house fell away behind them. She had the king's letter still in her hand. She did not know what to say to a man who had remade her life in front of everyone, and so she said the true thing, which was, "You should not have. They will say you were dazzled by a royal favor." "It will damage you, Margaret," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and he said it as a man lays down a card he has held all evening, deliberately watching her face. "I made inquiries about you weeks ago. I knew where you went on your afternoons. I knew the old gentleman's name before tonight, and I told no one, because it was not mine to tell, and because I did not want you to think, ever, that it was the reason." He drew from the inner pocket of his coat the small thing he carried always, and he opened his hand, and it was a miniature, a worn oval painting of a laughing young man with the Duke's own eyes. "My brother," he said. "I carry him because I failed him. I let the season make me a man who was too busy and too proud to forbid a foolish wager, and he drowned for it, and I have not laughed since, and I had stopped believing I deserved to. And then I watched you open a locked gate for his son, and asked nothing for it, and Tom laughed, and I remembered what it was for a person to be good without wanting to be seen being good. That is what I understood long before any letter came. Not your worth to a court. Your worth." Margaret looked at the laughing painted face of the drowned brother, and then at the living, grieving face of the man who carried him, and the cold place where she had kept 3 seasons of being told what she was simply, quietly, gave way. She did not weep even then, but she put her ungloved hand over his hand that held the miniature, and she said, "You will have to be patient with me. I have had a great deal of practice at not being chosen. I am not certain I know how to be." "Then we will practice," said the Duke of Wexford, "the other thing." And he raised her hand and pressed his mouth to her bare knuckles, slowly, his eyes on hers, and the warmth that climbed her throat. This time she did not try to argue away. They were married in the autumn, quietly, in the small church where her father had once preached, with the king's blessing sent by letter, and the boy Tom standing up beside the Duke in a new coat, holding the ring as though it were a live thing that might escape. The dowager came. She sat in the front pew on the bride's side, which no one had asked her to do, and she did not smile. But she stayed for the whole of it, and afterward she took Margaret's 2 hands in her own dry ones and said, "I was wrong about you. I'm very seldom wrong. Do not let it go to your head." And Margaret, who understood by now exactly what that cost her, said that she would not, and meant it, and somewhere behind the old woman's eyes, a door that had been shut for 70 years opened the width of a hand. The first snow of the new year fell on Wexford in December, the way snow falls on old stone houses, softening the hard lines of them, settling on the bare trees of the park, where Tom had built a fort and refused to come inside until his fingers were too cold to feel. Inside, the fires were lit in every room, and the great cold house had begun slowly to learn how to be warm again. Margaret sat in the library with the boy curled against her side, while the snow came down past the tall windows, and she read aloud to him the way she had once read to an old man near the palace, in the same unhurried voice, asking nothing of him. And Tom listened the way a child listens when he has finally decided he is safe. On the table beside her lay 2 things. One was a letter, much folded, that had come from the palace at Christmas, in which an old friend wrote that he had heard the news and was glad, and that he had always known a great deal could be told about a person by how they read aloud to someone who could not reward them. The other was the small, worn miniature of a laughing young man, which the Duke had taken from the inner pocket of his coat at last, and set out where the light could reach it, so that the brother he had carried alone for 3 years might sit. Now, in a warm room, among people who were learning how to laugh again. Margaret reached out and turned it a little toward the fire, so the painted face caught the light. Then she went on reading, and the snow went on falling, and the boy's breathing slowed and steadied against her side, and for the first time in a very long time, the woman the world had decided not to see was exactly, precisely, where she was meant to be. If Margaret's journey moved you, stay a moment in the quiet of it before you go, and know that the small, unseen good you do is seen by someone. Thank you for staying until the end.